Let me tell you about the lie that might be true. In 360 BC, a philosopher in Athens wrote about a civilization that destroyed itself 9,000 years before he was born. He gave measurements, he described their architecture, their government, their military. He told you exactly where it was. And then he died, leaving behind a story that no one has ever been able to prove, and no one has ever been able to forget. 24 centuries later, we are still looking. Every decade or so, someone announces they have finally found it. Marine archaeologists, satellite researchers, amateur historians with sonar equipment and determination, they point to formations off the coast of Spain, patterns in the Sahara Desert visible from space, underwater structures near Cuba, geological anomalies in the Mediterranean. They hold press conferences, they show compelling images. The headlines read, "Atlantis found at last." And for a moment, just a moment, we think maybe this time it is real, and then the story slips away again, back into the depths, back into mystery. Here is what makes this strange. Plato, the man who told us about Atlantis, was not a historian. He was a philosopher. He wrote dialogues where Socrates debated justice and truth. He invented the concept of ideal forms. He imagined a perfect republic that never existed. The man made things up for a living. His job was to construct arguments, not document reality. So why are serious scientists still searching for this place? Why did the United States Navy dedicate resources in 1968 to studying underwater formations near Bimini that might match his description? Why do geologists argue about it in peer-reviewed journals? Why in 2024 did a research team using advanced bathymetric sonar announce they had detected unusual geometric patterns on the seafloor near the Azores? And why did that announcement make international news? Because of the details. The uncomfortable, specific, inexplicable details. Plato did not just say there was an advanced civilization that sank beneath the waves. He told you it was located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar. He said the central island was 15 stadia across. That is approximately 1.7 miles, if you are doing the conversion. He described concentric rings of water and land, alternating, with precise measurements for each ring. He explained their irrigation system, their naval harbour that could fit 1,200 ships. He named 9 kings across generations. He told you about their laws, which were inscribed on a pillar of orichalcum, a metal that glowed like fire. He described their elephants, their hot and cold springs, the red, white, and black stone they quarried from the island itself. This is not how you write a parable. This is how you document a place. And here is what keeps people awake at 3 a.m, reading research papers and comparing ancient maps. Plato did not just invent this story out of nowhere. He said he got it from his great-grandfather Solon, who was one of the wisest men in Athens, a lawmaker so respected that his name became synonymous with wisdom. And Solon, according to Plato, heard it from Egyptian priests at the Temple of Sais during his travels. The priests told him it happened 9,000 years before their conversation. They said Greek civilization was young, and the Greeks kept forgetting their own history because catastrophes wiped out their records. But Egypt remembered. Egypt kept records, and Egypt remembered the island civilization that became too proud, that tried to conquer the Mediterranean world, and that was destroyed in a single day and night by earthquakes and floods, until it disappeared beneath the sea. If this was just Plato making up a cautionary tale about hubris and divine punishment, why did he ground it in such a specific chain of testimony? Why involve his own ancestor? Why name the Egyptian temple? 300 years after Plato died, a philosopher named Crantor traveled to Egypt to investigate the story. He claimed he found the original records that the priests of Sais had shown to Solon, inscribed on temple columns. But we do not have those records now. We only have Crantor saying he saw them, which means we have testimony about testimony about testimony, a game of ancient telephone that either points to something real or reveals nothing but how much we want it to be real. And maybe that is the actual mystery. Not whether Atlantis existed, but why we cannot let it go. Think about what we have done with this story. We have searched every ocean. We have used satellites to scan the Sahara. We have sent submersibles into the Mediterranean and sonar equipment along the mid-Atlantic ridge. We have proposed over 50 different locations across 6 continents. Some researchers say it was in Antarctica before the ice covered it. Others say it was in Indonesia. There are people who believe it was in Sweden, in Bolivia, in Ireland, in the North Sea. We have spent more time and resources looking for this place than we have looking for civilizations we know existed. We have archaeological sites all over the world that are barely funded, barely excavated, slowly being reclaimed by jungle and sand and time. But Atlantis gets documentaries and expedition funding and passionate debates at academic conferences. In May of 2024, a team using multi-beam sonar mapping detected what they described as geometric patterns on the seafloor, approximately 400 miles west of Portugal, near the Azores archipelago. The formations appeared rectangular. They appeared to be arranged in a grid. The depth was approximately 3,000 feet below current sea level. The announcement made headlines in 17 countries. Social media exploded with speculation. Within 48 hours, 3 different research groups announced they were seeking funding to investigate further. Within a week, skeptics published articles explaining how natural geological processes could create similar patterns. Within 2 weeks, the story had faded from the news cycle, but it has not faded from our minds. Because here is what happened next. Thousands of people, regular people, not scientists or historians, they downloaded sonar data. They studied geological surveys. They compared underwater topography to Plato's measurements. They formed online communities to share their findings. They stayed up late, like you might be doing right now, trying to solve a mystery that no one can prove even exists. This is what Atlantis does to us. It pulls us in. It makes us wonder. It makes us look at the ocean differently, like the water is hiding something just out of reach. And maybe it is, because here is the thing we forget when we talk about Atlantis. The ocean does hide things. The ocean has swallowed entire coastlines since the last ice age. Sea levels have risen 400 feet in the past 20,000 years. Cities that existed when woolly mammoths walked the earth are now under 300 feet of water. We know this. We have found drowned settlements. We have mapped submerged river valleys that used to be dry land. We have proven that human civilizations built homes and harbors on ground that is now seafloor. 80% of the ocean remains unexplored. We have better maps of Mars than we have of our own ocean floor. There could be structures down there right now, stone foundations and harbor walls, and things we would recognize as unmistakably human, and we would never know unless we happened to point the right equipment at the right square mile of seafloor. So when people search for Atlantis, they are not necessarily crazy. They are responding to a very reasonable question. If civilizations have been swallowed by rising seas, and if someone 2,400 years ago wrote a detailed description of exactly that happening, is it really so impossible that he was describing something real? That is the question I want to explore with you. Not whether Atlantis was exactly what Plato said it was, but whether the story points to something true that we have forgotten, whether there is a reason this legend refuses to disappear. My name is Mr. H, and I make these long documentaries for people who are curious about history's mysteries and who maybe, just maybe, want something to listen to as they drift off to sleep. If that is you, perfect. Lower your screen brightness. Let your eyes rest. I will be here, telling you this story, and you can follow it as far as you want before sleep takes you. Before we go further, do me a favor. Drop a comment and tell me where you are right now and what time it is. I love knowing that people all over the world are wondering about the same mysteries at 3 a.m, or during lunch break, or whenever you have found this. It makes the search feel less lonely. Now, let us start where it started, with a philosopher in ancient Athens who told a story so detailed, so specific, so strangely believable that we are still searching for proof 24 centuries later. The first thing you need to know about Plato is that he was 70 years old when he started writing about Atlantis. This was not early work. This was not the philosophical experimenting of a young man trying to make a name for himself. By the time he sat down to write the Timaeus and the Critias, the 2 dialogues where Atlantis appears, he had already written the Republic. He had already established his academy in Athens. He was, without exaggeration, one of the most influential thinkers in the Greek world. And yet he spent the final years of his life writing about an island that supposedly sank into the ocean 9,000 years earlier. The story appears in two places. First, briefly, in the Timaeus, where it is introduced as background to a larger discussion about the ideal state. Then, in much greater detail, in the Critias, which reads less like philosophy and more like a historical chronicle that got interrupted mid-sentence. Because here is the strange thing. Plato never finished the Critias. The dialogue just stops, right in the middle of describing how Zeus called together all the gods to punish Atlantis for its corruption. We get to the moment of divine judgment, and then nothing. The text ends. Some scholars think he died before finishing it. Others think he lost interest. A few suggest he realized he had said too much, revealed sources he should have kept hidden, and deliberately left it incomplete. We will never know. What we do know is what he wrote before it ended. And those details are the problem. Let me walk you through them the way I would walk through a crime scene, because that is what this feels like. Evidence. Not allegory. Evidence. Plato says the island of Atlantis lay in the ocean beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Now, every educated Greek in his time knew the Pillars of Hercules meant the Strait of Gibraltar, the narrow passage between Spain and Morocco where the Mediterranean meets the Atlantic. He is not being vague. He is giving you a location. West of Gibraltar, out in the ocean, he says the central island was 15 stadia in diameter. A stadion is a Greek unit of measurement, about 600 feet. 15 stadia would be roughly 1.7 miles across. That is specific. That is the kind of detail you give when you are describing something real, not inventing a metaphor. But it gets more specific. The island, he says, had alternating rings of land and water. 3 rings of water and 2 rings of land, arranged in perfect circles around the central island. The outer ring of land was 3 stadia wide. The middle ring was 2 stadia wide. The rings of water varied in width, with the outermost being 3 stadia, the middle one being 2 stadia, and the innermost being 1 stadion. Plato gives you these measurements like an architect presenting blueprints. He tells you there were bridges connecting the rings and tunnels wide enough for ships to pass from one ring to the next, all the way to the central island where the royal palace stood. He describes a covered canal, large enough for a trireme, the biggest warship of his era, to sail through. This is not how you write mythology. Mythology gives you Mount Olympus wreathed in clouds. It gives you heroes who sail to the edge of the world. It does not give you precise measurements in stadia and engineering specifications for naval tunnels. And he does not stop there. Plato tells you about their agriculture. He says the outer plain of Atlantis, beyond the rings, was rectangular, measuring 3,000 stadia by 2,000 stadia. That is approximately 340 miles by 225 miles. A massive fertile plain, protected by mountains to the north. He describes an irrigation system of intersecting canals that divided the plain into sections, allowing them to bring water from the mountains and transport crops by boat to the city. He tells you about their military organization. 10 kings, he says, each ruling a portion of the island, each required to contribute specific numbers of soldiers and ships in times of war. 120,000 hoplites, 10,000 chariots, 1,200 ships. These are not round numbers pulled from imagination. These are the kinds of figures you get from historical records or military census documents. He describes their buildings. He says they had hot springs and cold springs, both on the central island, which they used for baths and irrigation. They built 2 temples, one to Poseidon and one to Cleito, his mortal wife, who became the mother of the first Atlantean kings. The temple of Poseidon, he says, was a stadion in length, 3 plethra in width, and proportionately tall. Inside stood a golden statue of Poseidon driving 6 winged horses, so tall his head touched the ceiling. The outer walls of the palace, Plato writes, were covered in brass. The inner walls were covered in tin, and the innermost walls, surrounding the temple itself, were covered in orichalcum, a mysterious metal that shone with a red light. Now, you can dismiss orichalcum as fantasy. Scholars have been trying to figure out what metal Plato meant for 2,000 years. Was it a copper alloy? Was it amber? Was it a mistranslation of some other material? We do not know, but notice what happens when you focus on the one impossible detail. You ignore all the possible ones, the hot and cold springs, for example. If Atlantis was a volcanic island in the Atlantic, hot springs are not miraculous. They are geology. The concentric ring structure. You know what else has concentric rings? When a volcano collapses after an eruption, it can create circular patterns of land and water. Santorini in Greece has this exact structure. So does Crater Lake in Oregon. The shape Plato describes is not impossible. It is volcanic. But here is where I start to get uncomfortable with the easy academic dismissal. If Plato was just inventing a cautionary tale about hubris, why put in all this geological accuracy? Why describe a volcanic island with hot springs and a circular caldera structure, unless you were describing a volcanic island with hot springs and a circular caldera structure? Let me show you how scholars usually handle this. They say Plato was writing a noble lie. This is a concept he himself introduced in the Republic, the idea that philosophers might need to tell useful falsehoods to teach moral lessons. So, the argument goes, Atlantis is a noble lie, a fabricated story designed to teach Athenians about the dangers of imperial overreach and moral corruption, and maybe that is true. Maybe Plato invented every detail to serve his philosophical purposes, except he does something strange. He grounds the story in testimony, real testimony from real people. In the Timaeus, before he even mentions Atlantis, Plato has the character Critias explain where this story comes from. Critias says he heard it from his grandfather, also named Critias, who heard it from his father Dropides, who heard it from his close friend Solon, and Solon, Critias says, heard it directly from Egyptian priests during his visit to the city of Sais in the Nile Delta. Now, Solon was not a fictional character. He was one of the most famous figures in Athenian history. He lived around 600 BC, about 240 years before Plato was born. Solon reformed Athenian law. He wrote poetry that survived for centuries. Ancient historians from Herodotus to Plutarch wrote about him. When Plato invokes Solon's name, he is not invoking some mythical figure from the distant past. He is invoking someone whose life was documented, whose family was known, whose reputation was unimpeachable. This is like a modern writer saying, I heard this story from my great-grandfather, who heard it from Thomas Jefferson, who heard it from French historians during his time as ambassador to France. You cannot make that claim casually. People can check. People know Jefferson's life. They know what he did and where he went. If you invoke that name, you are either telling the truth or making a very checkable lie. And it gets stranger. Plato has Critias say that Solon planned to write an epic poem about Atlantis, that he considered it the greatest story he had ever heard, but he never finished it because he was too busy with political affairs when he returned to Athens. Why include that detail? Why say Solon intended to write about this but never did? If you are inventing a story, you do not need to explain why your source did not publish his own version. That is the kind of detail someone adds when they are explaining an actual historical situation. When they are saying, this story exists in my family's oral tradition because my ancestor heard it but never wrote it down, so I am writing it down now. 300 years after Plato died, a philosopher named Crantor did something remarkable. He actually traveled to Egypt to check the story. This was around 260 BC. Crantor was the first major commentator on Plato's work, and he took the Atlantis story seriously enough to investigate it. According to later sources, Crantor claimed he found records at the Temple of Sais that confirmed what Plato had written. He said the Egyptian priests showed him columns with inscriptions that matched the Atlantis account. Now, we do not have Crantor's original report. We only have other ancient writers referencing what Crantor said, and we definitely do not have those temple columns, which means we have either a historical trail pointing to something real, or we have evidence of how badly ancient scholars wanted Atlantis to be real, just like we do. But here is what I keep coming back to. If this was pure fiction, why did serious philosophers in the ancient world treat it like history? Crantor was not alone. Posidonius, a Greek philosopher around 100 BC, accepted the Atlantis story as historical. So did Strabo, one of the greatest geographers of the ancient world. These were not gullible people. These were scholars who spent their lives evaluating sources and evidence. Were they all wrong? Probably. Academic consensus today says, yes, they were wrong. Plato made it up. Case closed. But I want you to notice something. Modern scholars dismiss Atlantis as fiction primarily because we have not found it. Not because the account is impossible, not because the details are internally inconsistent, but because we have not found it. That is not quite the same thing as proving it never existed. And that brings us to the uncomfortable question. What if Plato was not inventing a philosophical parable? What if he was not creating a noble lie? What if he was doing exactly what he said he was doing, passing along a story that came through his family from Solon, who heard it from Egyptian priests, who kept records that went back thousands of years before Greek civilization even existed? What if the details are so specific because they were specific in the source material? I'm not saying that is what happened. I am saying the possibility makes me uneasy, because if there is even a chance that Plato was working from older sources, from Egyptian records that preserved information about a pre-flood civilization, then we are not looking for a myth. We are looking for a grave. Let me tell you what it looks like when the world ends. Around 1600 BC, give or take a few decades, an island in the Aegean Sea called Thera experienced what volcanologists now classify as a VEI-7 eruption. VEI stands for Volcanic Explosivity Index, a scale from 0 to 8 that measures the destructive power of volcanic events. For context, Mount St. Helens in 1980 was a VEI-5. Krakatoa in 1883 was a VEI-6. VEI-7 is the kind of eruption that does not just destroy a mountain, it erases it. Thera ejected somewhere between 60 and 87 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere. To picture that, imagine a cube of rock and ash 12 miles on each side, hurled into the sky. The explosion was heard across the Mediterranean. The ash cloud reached the stratosphere, blocking sunlight across multiple continents. And when the magma chamber emptied, the center of the island collapsed into the void, creating a caldera so deep that seawater rushed in to fill it. The resulting tsunami reached heights estimated between 35 and 150 feet, depending on coastal geography and distance from the eruption. Walls of water traveling at 500 miles per hour slammed into Crete, into the coast of Turkey, into Egypt, into every shoreline community around the eastern Mediterranean. The Minoan civilization, one of the most sophisticated cultures in the Bronze Age, never fully recovered. Their cities on Crete showed evidence of sudden abandonment. Akrotiri, a Minoan settlement on Thera itself, was buried under volcanic ash so quickly that archaeologists found pottery still on tables, food still in storage jars, frescoes perfectly preserved on walls. The people had fled. They took almost nothing with them, and then the island they left behind ceased to exist. This is documented history. We have the geological evidence. We have the ash layers in ice cores from Greenland. We have the radiocarbon dates. We have the ruins. And here is why it matters for Atlantis. The Thera eruption proves that advanced island civilizations can be destroyed in a single day, that cities can vanish beneath the sea, that tsunamis can rewrite coastlines, that everything Plato described as happening to Atlantis has happened in recorded history to a real place. Most scholars who think Atlantis has any basis in reality believe Plato was describing Thera and the Minoans. The timeline is wrong, they say. Plato or his sources got confused and added several thousand years, but the core event, the volcanic island destroyed by earthquake and flood, and maybe they are right. Maybe Thera is Atlantis, remembered imperfectly across 1,000 years of oral tradition before it reached Plato. But Thera is not the only island that disappeared. It is not even the only landmass that sank during the time humans were building civilizations. There is a place that does not exist anymore called Doggerland. You will not find it on any modern map because it is currently beneath the North Sea, between Britain and mainland Europe. But 15,000 years ago, Doggerland was not underwater. It was a landscape, a place with hills and rivers and forests, a place where people lived. We know this because fishing trawlers keep pulling up evidence. Mammoth bones, stone tools, harpoon points carved from antler. In 1931, a fishing boat working off the coast of Norfolk dredged up a barbed antler point that dated to around 12,000 BC. Since then, hundreds of artifacts have been recovered from the seafloor, fragments of a world that drowned. The University of Bradford spent years mapping Doggerland using seismic survey data, originally collected by oil companies. What they found was a complete Mesolithic landscape preserved in mud. River valleys, coastlines, a marshy area that would have been rich with fish and birds. At its peak, around 10,000 BC, Doggerland may have been one of the most densely populated areas in Europe because it was flat, fertile, coastal, and connected Britain to the continent, and then the ice melted. This was not a single catastrophic event like Thera. This was slower. As the glaciers retreated at the end of the last ice age, sea levels rose about 400 feet over the course of several thousand years. That sounds gradual, and on a geological timescale, it is. But on a human timescale, it was a disaster that unfolded across generations. Imagine living in a coastal village and noticing, over your lifetime, that the shoreline keeps moving closer. Your grandparents tell you about fishing spots that are now underwater. The island you could walk to as a child now requires a boat. Your children will see even more land disappear. Their children will watch the forests where you hunted become tidal flats. And eventually, generations down the line, the people of Doggerland migrated. They had to. They moved to higher ground in what is now Britain and the Netherlands and Denmark. They left behind their settlements, their sacred sites, their dead, all of it swallowed by rising water. But there was one final catastrophe. Around 6,100 BC, a massive underwater landslide occurred off the coast of Norway. This is called the Storegga Slide, and it was triggered by the destabilization of methane hydrate deposits on the continental shelf. When it let go, it displaced approximately 350 cubic kilometers of sediment. The resulting tsunami hit Scotland with waves 25 meters high. It swept across Doggerland, which by that point was already reduced to a low-lying archipelago of islands. After Storegga, Doggerland was finished. The remaining islands were submerged. The land bridge between Britain and Europe was severed. People who had lived there for thousands of years became refugees, scattered to coastlines that were themselves still changing. And we only know about this because geologists started asking questions about oil deposits. If they had not mapped the North Sea floor for petroleum, we would have no idea that an entire inhabited landscape was down there. We would have no idea that Britain was not always an island. We would have no idea that our ancestors watched their world drown. Now think about what that means globally. Since the last glacial maximum around 20,000 years ago, sea levels have risen approximately 120 meters. That is almost 400 feet. Every coastline on Earth has moved inland by miles, or in some cases hundreds of miles. Continental shelves that were dry land, that may have supported forests and rivers and human settlements, are now seafloor. If there were coastal civilizations during the late Paleolithic or early Neolithic, if people built communities on river deltas, or natural harbors or fertile plains near the Ice Age coastline, then 95% of that evidence is now underwater, and we have surveyed less than 20% of the ocean floor in any detail. We have seriously explored maybe 5%. Let me put that in perspective. If Atlantis existed as a coastal or island civilization any time before 8000 BC, and if it was destroyed by rising seas or a localized catastrophe, the odds that we would have accidentally discovered it by now are extremely low. The odds that we would have found it without knowing exactly where to look are nearly zero. This is what keeps me up at night. Not whether Atlantis was real, but the realization that dozens or hundreds of Atlantises could be real, that we could have lost entire chapters of human history to the ocean, and we would never know because we are not looking. There is another hypothesis that makes this even more disturbing. In 1997, two marine geologists named Walter Pittman and William Ryan published a book proposing that the Black Sea was once a freshwater lake, sitting about 500 feet below its current level. Around 5600 BC, they argued, Rising Mediterranean waters breached the natural dam at the Bosphorus Strait. When the dam broke, seawater poured into the Black Sea basin at a rate of about 50 cubic kilometers per day. 50 cubic kilometers every single day. That is 200 times the flow of Niagara Falls. The sound would have been audible for miles. The coastline would have advanced by as much as a mile per day in flat areas. If people were living around that freshwater lake, and evidence suggests they were, then they watched a flood that must have seemed apocalyptic. Their villages disappeared under advancing water. Their farmland was submerged. Their entire world was drowned in a matter of months. Pittman and Ryan suggested this might be the origin of the flood myths that appear in so many cultures around the Mediterranean and Near East. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the story of Noah, the Greek myth of Deucalion. Maybe they were all remembering this event. The hypothesis remains controversial. Some geologists argue the flooding was more gradual. Others accept the rapid flood but debate the dates. But here is what nobody debates. The Black Sea was definitely lower. It definitely filled. And there definitely were human settlements around its shores that are now underwater. In 2000, Robert Ballard, the man who found the Titanic, led an expedition that discovered ancient shorelines and what appeared to be structural remains at 300 feet depth in the Black Sea. We have proof that catastrophic floods happened. We have proof that civilizations were destroyed by them. We have proof that rising seas swallowed inhabited landscapes. All of this is established science. So when Plato describes an island civilization destroyed by earthquakes and floods in a single day and night, he is not describing anything impossible. He is describing the kind of event that has happened repeatedly in human history. But there is one more catastrophe we need to talk about. One that makes all the others look small. And it happened right around the time Plato said Atlantis was destroyed, between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago. The Earth experienced an abrupt climate reversal called the Younger Dryas. The name comes from a flower, Dryas octopetala, that thrives in cold conditions. Botanists noticed that pollen from this plant suddenly reappeared in sediment layers across Europe during a period when the climate should have been warming. What happened was this. The Ice Age was ending. And then, suddenly, violently, temperatures dropped again. In some regions, average temperatures fell by 15 degrees Celsius in less than a decade. In Greenland, ice core data shows temperature drops of up to 22 degrees Fahrenheit in a single year. A single year. The Younger Dryas lasted for about 1,200 years. During that time, glaciers advanced again. Forests died. Woolly mammoths, saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths, short-faced bears, all gone. In North America, the Clovis culture, the earliest widespread culture in the New World, collapsed. For decades, geologists assumed the Younger Dryas was caused by changes in ocean circulation. The prevailing theory was that massive meltwater from glaciers disrupted the Gulf Stream, causing a climate feedback loop. But in 2007, a team of scientists led by Richard Firestone published a paper proposing something else. They argued that a comet or asteroid impacted or exploded over North America at the beginning of the Younger Dryas, triggering the climate reversal. The evidence they presented included microspherules, nanodiamonds, and platinum anomalies in sediment layers dated to 12,800 years ago. These are the kinds of materials you find at impact sites. They also pointed to a massive layer of black matte, carbon-rich sediment that appears at Younger Dryas boundary sites across North America, suggesting widespread burning. The scientific community reacted skeptically. Some dismissed the impact hypothesis entirely. But over the past 15 years, more evidence has accumulated. In 2019, researchers analyzing material from Abu Huraira, an archaeological site in Syria, found melt glass. This is glass formed when sand or soil is subjected to temperatures exceeding 2,200 degrees Celsius. The only known natural processes that create such temperatures are lightning strikes, volcanic eruptions, and cosmic impacts. Abu Huraira is not volcanic, and there was way too much melt glass for lightning. In 2018, researchers announced the discovery of a massive impact crater beneath the Hiawatha Glacier in Greenland. The crater is 31 kilometers wide. It is buried under ice. And while the dating remains uncertain, it could be from the Younger Dryas period. We are not certain yet what caused the Younger Dryas, but we are certain it happened. We are certain it was catastrophic. We are certain it coincided with mass extinctions and cultural collapses across multiple continents. And here is the number that should make you pause. Plato said Atlantis was destroyed 9,000 years before Solon's visit to Egypt around 590 BC. 9,000 years before 590 BC is 9,500 BC, give or take. The Younger Dryas boundary, the moment of impact or climate catastrophe, is dated to 12,800 years ago. These numbers are in the same neighborhood. Not exact, but close enough that you have to wonder if Plato's Egyptian sources were remembering something real. If the 9,000-year number was an approximation of a genuine catastrophe that destroyed coastal civilizations around the world, maybe Atlantis was not one island. Maybe it was the name later cultures gave to the whole world that existed before the Younger Dryas, before the impacts, before the floods, before everything changed. We will never know for certain. But we know the catastrophe was real. We know the world ended, at least for the people living in it, and we know that almost no one remembers. In 1513, a Turkish admiral named Piri Reis was compiling a world map in Constantinople. This was the age of exploration. Columbus had reached the Americas just 21 years earlier. Magellan had not yet circumnavigated the globe. The Pacific Ocean was still called the South Sea, and most of it remained uncharted by European sailors. Piri Reis was not just a military commander. He was a cartographer, a scholar, a collector of maps. He had access to the imperial library, to captured Portuguese charts, to Greek and Arabic manuscripts that preserved geographical knowledge from earlier centuries. When he created his map, he wrote notes in the margins explaining his sources. He said he used about 20 older maps, including one that had belonged to Christopher Columbus himself. The map he produced showed the Atlantic Ocean, the coast of West Africa, the eastern coast of South America, and several Atlantic islands. Most of it matched what European explorers were discovering in real time. But there was one section that should not have been there. At the bottom of the map, curving along the southern edge, Piri Reis drew a coastline. It had mountains. It had inlets and bays. It appeared detailed, specific, not like the blank spaces or speculative sketches that usually filled unknown regions on medieval maps. And, according to some researchers, that coastline matches the northern edge of Antarctica. Here is the problem. Antarctica was not officially discovered until 1820. The first confirmed sighting was by Russian and British expeditions. The first landing was in 1895, and the coastline beneath the ice, the actual rock shoreline that the ice sheet covers, was not mapped until the 1950s using seismic sounding equipment. So how could a map from 1513 show it? The mainstream explanation is simple. It does not. What Piri Reis drew was the coast of South America, distorted and extended southward due to errors in projection and incomplete information. Medieval and Renaissance maps are full of mistakes. Coastlines get stretched. Islands get placed in wrong locations. Cartographers filled in gaps with speculation and artistic license. The similarity to Antarctica is coincidence, pattern recognition run wild, people seeing what they want to see, and that explanation works fine until you look closely at the details. In 1956, a cartography enthusiast named Charles Hapgood started studying the Piri Reis map. Hapgood was a professor at Keene State College in New Hampshire. He was not a professional cartographer, but he was obsessed with maps, especially old ones that seemed to contain impossible information. He noticed that the southern coastline on the Piri Reis map had features, bays and inlets, and river mouths that did not match South America, but did match the seismic profiles of subglacial Antarctica. Hapgood took his analysis to the United States Air Force. In 1960, the Strategic Air Command had some of the most advanced cartographic capabilities in the world. He asked them to evaluate whether the Piri Reis map could represent Antarctica before the ice covered it. The response he received, signed by Captain Lorenzo Burrows of the USAF, is a matter of public record. It said the coastal features shown on the lower part of the map matched the Queen Maud Land coast of Antarctica, and suggested the map had been drawn when the land was free of ice. The letter concluded that this raised questions about how such information could have been obtained in 1513. Now, before we get too excited, we need to acknowledge something. That letter was one officer's opinion, not an official USAF position. Burroughs was probably being polite to an enthusiastic civilian researcher. The Air Force never conducted a formal study, and subsequent cartographic analysis by professional historians has mostly rejected the Antarctica hypothesis. Most scholars today agree that Piri Reis was drawing South America, not Antarctica. They point out that his map shows rivers and animals, which Antarctica definitely does not have. They note that the orientation is wrong for Antarctica. They argue that we are forcing modern geography onto a Renaissance map that was working from incomplete and distorted sources, and I am inclined to believe them. I really am, except there are other maps that create the same uncomfortable question. In 1531, a French cartographer named Oronteus Phineas created a world map that showed Antarctica as a continent. This was almost 300 years before anyone officially discovered it. The continent on his map is centered on the South Pole. It has two major lobes, which roughly match East and West Antarctica. It has interior mountains and coastal features. Again, mainstream scholars say this is speculation. Medieval cartographers believed in a southern continent for theoretical reasons. They thought the Earth needed landmass in the south to balance the landmass in the north. So they drew Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land, as a placeholder. Oronteus Phineas was just following that tradition. But here is what bothers me. The shape is not random. It actually looks like Antarctica. The proportions are roughly correct. The two-lobe structure matches the actual geography. And some researchers claim the interior features align with the subglacial topography that we did not map until the 20th century. Then there is the Philippe Buache map from 1737. Buache was the royal geographer of France, a serious scholar. His map shows Antarctica divided into two major landmasses, separated by a channel of water. And here is the thing. Antarctica is actually two landmasses, East Antarctica and West Antarctica, separated by a subglacial channel that was not discovered until satellite surveys and ice-penetrating radar became available in the 1950s and 60s. How did Buache know that in 1737? His map explicitly shows Antarctica without ice, divided by an ocean passage that would exist if the ice sheet melted. Buache wrote that he based his map on older source maps. He did not claim to have discovered this himself. He claimed to be copying information from earlier cartographic traditions. This is where the mystery gets deeper, because there is a class of maps called Portolan charts that date back to the 13th and 14th centuries. These are nautical charts used by Mediterranean sailors, and they are weirdly accurate. Portolan charts show the Mediterranean coastline, the Black Sea, and parts of the Atlantic, with a level of precision that should not exist. They use a system of rhumb lines, compass directions radiating from central points that allowed sailors to navigate accurately. But here is the mystery. Nobody knows where they came from. The Portolan charts appear suddenly in the historical record around 1290. They do not seem to evolve from earlier maps. They do not show the gradual improvement you would expect as cartographic techniques developed. They just appear, fully formed, more accurate than anything that came before, or anything that would come after, until the 18th century. Medieval maps of Europe and Asia were terrible. They showed Jerusalem at the center of the world. They depicted landmasses as crude shapes. They were theological diagrams more than geographical tools. But Portolan charts were different. They were accurate enough that sailors actually used them. They were accurate enough that when 19th century scholars compared them to modern surveys, they found the Mediterranean coastlines were correct to within a few miles. How did medieval sailors produce maps more accurate than their own knowledge should have allowed? Charles Hapgood spent years trying to answer that question. His theory, published in a book called Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, was that the Portolan charts were copies of much older maps that originated with a sophisticated maritime civilization that existed before recorded history. A civilization that had surveyed coastlines around the world, that had navigational technology we assumed did not exist, and that passed down its charts through generations until they reached medieval European sailors who had no idea where they actually came from. Hapgood believed that civilization was Atlantis. Now, I am not here to tell you that Hapgood was right. The academic community largely dismissed his work. Professional cartographers have pointed out errors in his analysis. They have shown that Portolan charts, while impressive, are not as impossibly accurate as he claimed. They have demonstrated that the charts could have been produced through careful coastal surveys and sailing measurements accumulated over generations. But here is what I cannot dismiss. The question remains, if medieval sailors created these charts through their own observations, why did accuracy decline after the Portolan tradition ended? Why did European maps of the 1500s and 1600s become less accurate than the Portolan charts from the 1300s? If this was knowledge that medieval sailors developed themselves, why did they lose it? And why do some of these maps seem to show coastlines that were only accessible before post-glacial sea level rise? Graham Hancock has spent decades arguing that these maps are evidence of a lost civilization. He points to the Piri Reis map, the Oronteus Phineus map, the Portolan charts, and dozens of other examples. He says they represent fragments of knowledge from before the Younger Dryas, before the catastrophe, copied and recopied until they reached sailors who no longer understood what they possessed. Mainstream scholars call this pseudo-archaeology. They say it is cherry-picking anomalies and ignoring context. They say it is confirmation bias, seeing lost civilizations in every historical mystery. And they might be right. They probably are right. But I want you to notice something. The dismissal always comes down to the same argument. We have not found physical evidence of this advanced ancient civilization. Therefore, it did not exist. Therefore, these maps must be explained some other way. Therefore, Hapgood and Hancock are wrong. That logic only works if you assume we would have found the evidence by now. If coastal civilizations existed before the Younger Dryas, before the sea level rise, their cities would be hundreds of feet underwater. We have explored maybe 5% of the ocean floor. We have seriously surveyed even less. So when someone says we have no evidence of a lost maritime civilization, what they mean is we have no evidence where we have looked, which is not quite the same thing as proving it never existed. I do not know if the Piri Reis map shows Antarctica. I do not know if Portolan charts were copied from ancient sources. I do not know if there was a civilization sophisticated enough to map the world before the ice melted. But I know the maps exist. I know they contain accurate information that should not be there according to standard historical timelines. I know nobody has provided a fully satisfying explanation for where that information came from. And I know that every time someone proposes an explanation involving lost knowledge from an earlier civilization, the academic response is to say, that is impossible. Therefore, it must be something else, without necessarily explaining what that something else is. This is where I get uncomfortable with easy explanations. Because the mainstream story, the story we are supposed to believe, has gaps in it too. It just has gaps we are more comfortable living with. Maybe the maps are just mistakes and coincidences. Maybe we are seeing patterns that are not there. Or maybe, somewhere deep underwater, there are harbour ruins that would explain everything. And we will never find them because we are not looking in the right place. There is a geologist in Spain who believes Atlantis is buried in marshland north of Cadiz. There is a satellite archaeologist who thinks it is in the Sahara Desert. There is a marine biologist who spent 15 years mapping underwater formations near Cuba. There is a retired architect who calculated that the dimensions perfectly match a submerged plateau off the coast of Cyprus. There is a team in Greece that says it was Santorini all along, just misremembered. There is a documentary filmmaker who is convinced it is beneath the ice of Antarctica. Over the past century, researchers have proposed more than 50 locations for Atlantis across 6 continents. That number is conservative. If you count every claim made on the internet, every local legend rebranded as the true Atlantis, every ambitious theory by amateur historians, the number climbs into the hundreds. You can trace the search on a globe and cover almost every ocean. The Atlantic, obviously. The Mediterranean from end to end. The Caribbean. The North Sea. The Black Sea. The South China Sea. Someone even proposed the Sea of Azov. And for landlocked locations, we have the Sahara, the Bolivian Altiplano, Sweden, Indonesia, and the Antarctic ice sheet. This should tell us something. When a lost civilization can be located virtually anywhere on Earth, when every decade brings a new announcement with compelling evidence that ultimately leads nowhere, we are not dealing with a simple historical mystery. We are dealing with something else. A mirror, maybe. A Rorschach test. A story so adaptable that it can fit almost any ancient ruins, any underwater formation, any geological anomaly that needs explaining. But some locations are more compelling than others. Some have actual evidence. Not proof, but evidence. Enough to keep serious researchers spending money and time and reputation on the search. Let me show you where people are looking and why each place seems so convincing until you look closer. The most obvious candidate is still Santorini. We talked about the Thera eruption earlier, the VEI-7 catastrophe that destroyed the island around 1600 BC. The archaeological site at Akrotiri shows a sophisticated Bronze Age civilization with multi-story buildings, advanced plumbing, beautiful frescoes. The island had the concentric ring structure from the volcanic caldera. It was destroyed suddenly by earthquakes and buried by volcanic ash. Ships and coastal cities around the Aegean were wiped out by tsunamis. Everything Plato described happened at Thera, except the timeline and the location. Thera is in the Aegean, not beyond the Pillars of Hercules, and it was destroyed 3,600 years ago, not 9,600 years ago. But if you assume Plato or his Egyptian sources got the numbers wrong, added a zero somewhere, confused thousands with hundreds, then Santorini fits. Greek archaeologist Spiridon Marinatos proposed this connection in the 1960s. He spent years excavating Akrotiri, convinced he was uncovering the real Atlantis. When he died in 1974, he was buried at the site. He never wavered in his belief. The problem is that Thera was not an empire. It was part of the Minoan civilization, centered on Crete. The Minoans were traders, not conquerors. They did not try to invade Athens or Egypt. They did not match Plato's description of Atlantis as an aggressive imperial power. And the timeline issue is not a small discrepancy. You cannot just add 6,000 years and call it a rounding error. So Santorini explains the catastrophe, but not the empire. It explains the rings, but not the war. It gives us a destroyed island civilization, but not Atlantis. Then there is the Strait of Gibraltar itself, the location Plato actually specified. In recent years, several researchers have focused on the area just west of Gibraltar, in the Gulf of Cadiz and the Atlantic waters off southern Spain. In 2011, a documentary team led by archaeologist Richard Freund announced they had found evidence of Atlantis in Doñana National Park, a marshland area north of Cadiz. Using satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, and underwater surveys, they identified what they claimed were the remains of a multi-ringed city buried beneath marshland and ocean sediment. They found evidence of a massive tsunami that struck the area sometime around 2000 BC. They suggested Atlantis was not an island in the deep Atlantic, but a coastal city destroyed by an earthquake and tsunami, then buried as the landscape changed over millennia. The Spanish government was not amused. Local archaeologists pointed out that the formations could easily be explained as Roman fish salting facilities, medieval salt pans, and natural geological features. The so-called rings were not concentric. The tsunami evidence was real but did not prove Atlantis, and the timeline was still wrong. But here is what makes the Cadiz area interesting. There was a real ancient city near there called Tartessos. It appears in Greek and biblical sources. The Greeks called it a wealthy trading civilization beyond the Pillars of Hercules, rich in silver and other metals. The Bible may reference it as Tarshish. It was powerful enough to have diplomatic relations with Eastern Mediterranean civilizations. And then, sometime around 500 BC, it vanished completely. We have references to Tartessos in literature, but we have never found the city. Some archaeologists think it was destroyed by Carthage. Others think it was buried by coastal changes and sediment. It is out there somewhere. A lost city beyond the Pillars of Hercules that was wealthy and powerful and then disappeared. Sound familiar? Maybe Atlantis was not Tartessos, but maybe stories about Tartessos merged with older myths, and Plato or his sources wove them together into the Atlantis narrative. Maybe this is how legends form: real places plus real catastrophes, plus generations of retelling, equals something that feels true but cannot be found. Now let me take you to the Bahamas. In 1968, a pilot flying over the island of Bimini noticed what looked like a road or wall underwater, just off the coast. It was made of rectangular stones, arranged in a linear formation about half a mile long. The stones appeared cut and placed, not randomly scattered. When divers investigated, they found what became known as the Bimini Road. Massive limestone blocks, some weighing several tons, arranged in straight lines and right angles. Some researchers, including archaeologist J. Manson Valentine, claimed this was evidence of an ancient harbour, a submerged structure built by a pre-Columbian civilization, maybe Atlantis. Geologists disagreed. They said the Bimini Road is beach rock, a natural formation created when calcium carbonate cements beach sediments together. Beach rock can crack in regular patterns due to stress and tidal action, creating the illusion of cut blocks. The rectangular shapes are natural. The linear arrangement is geological coincidence, but some anomalies remain. A few of the stones show what appear to be tool marks. Some have notches and grooves that look carved. The right-angle turns are hard to explain as purely natural, and multiple formations in the area, not just the main road, show similar patterns. The debate has continued for over 50 years. Every few years, someone surveys the site with new technology, finds something interesting, proposes it is artificial, and then other researchers explain it away as geology. The Bimini Road has become a case study in how we see patterns. Maybe it is a road. Maybe it is rocks. Maybe the truth is that we want it to be a road so badly that we cannot see it as just rocks. Across the Atlantic, in the North Sea, Doggerland remains the most scientifically documented lost landscape. We have mapped it. We have found tools and bones. We know people lived there. We know it drowned. But there is no evidence of cities or advanced civilization. Doggerland appears to have been inhabited by hunter-gatherers, Mesolithic people living in small communities, not empire builders, not the Atlantis Plato described. Still, some researchers point out that we have barely scratched the surface. The North Sea is murky, cold, and heavily fished. Underwater visibility is terrible. Systematic archaeological surveys are expensive and rare. If there were Neolithic or Bronze Age settlements in certain areas of Doggerland, we might not have found them yet simply because we have not looked. There are wilder theories. Bolivia, where some researchers claim the Altiplano Plateau matches Plato's description if you assume he meant a highland plain, not an island. Cyprus, where others have matched the dimensions to underwater plateaus. The Azores, Indonesia, Sardinia, Malta, Ireland. Each location has its champions, its evidence, its compelling argument for why this time, finally, we have found it. And then there is the proposal that gets the most attention online and the least respect from academics, the Eye of the Sahara. We are going to spend serious time with that one next, because it deserves its own discussion. But for now, just know that there is a 40-kilometer wide circular formation in Mauritania that looks exactly like Plato's description and sits in a desert that was once green. Here is what strikes me after looking at all these locations. Each one explains part of the mystery. Santorini explains the catastrophe. Tartessos explains the wealth and location. Doggerland explains the drowning. The Sahara explains the rings. Bimini explains the underwater ruins. But no single location explains everything. It is like we are looking at fragments of different stories that got combined, or like we are looking at one story that has been refracted through so many retellings that it now appears in multiple places, each version capturing different true details while losing others. Maybe there is no Atlantis. Maybe there are a dozen Atlantises, a dozen real civilizations that were destroyed at different times, in different ways, and all their stories merged over millennia into one legend that Plato recorded. Or maybe we are looking in the wrong places because we are making the wrong assumptions. Maybe Plato's measurements were wrong. Maybe his directions were wrong. Maybe the Egyptian priests who told Solon were working from corrupted records. Maybe 9,000 years was symbolic, not literal. Maybe beyond the Pillars of Hercules meant something different in ancient geography. If we relax even one of Plato's specifications, the number of possible locations multiplies exponentially. If we relax all of them, Atlantis could be anywhere, and that is the real problem. The search for Atlantis has become a search for meaning in ruins. Every ancient site that does not fit standard chronology gets proposed as Atlantis. Every underwater formation that looks geometric gets examined as a possible harbour. Every catastrophe in the archaeological record gets connected to the Atlantis story. We are not looking for a place anymore. We are looking for validation. Validation that the ancients were more sophisticated than we thought. Validation that mainstream archaeology might be missing something. Validation that there are still mysteries in the world. And maybe that is okay. Maybe the search itself matters more than what we find. But it means that every few years, when someone announces they have found Atlantis, you can already predict what will happen next. Initial excitement, media coverage, skeptical analysis, rebuttals, debate, and eventually, the claim fades, joins the list of proposed locations, and becomes part of the mythology rather than the solution. The island slips away again, back into the depths. If you are still with me, if this mystery has gotten under your skin the way it has gotten under mine, I would love to hear from you. Drop a comment and tell me which location you think is most convincing, or if you think we are all chasing ghosts. And if you are finding value in this kind of deep dive into history's shadows, a like genuinely helps more people discover these stories. I read every comment, and honestly, some of the best insights come from you. Now, let me show you the location that refuses to leave my mind. The one that looks so much like Plato's description it almost feels impossible. There is a place in the Sahara Desert that astronauts photograph from space because it looks like an eye staring back at them. Local people call it the Guelb-Richat. Scientists call it the Richat structure. Most people call it the Eye of the Sahara, and some people call it Atlantis. From the ground, you would not notice anything unusual. You would see sand, rock, low ridges, the occasional acacia tree struggling in the heat. The Richat structure sits in Mauritania, one of the most remote regions of the Western Sahara, hours from any significant settlement. It is hot, dry, desolate, not the kind of place you associate with lost civilizations. But from space, everything changes. The first clear images came from Gemini astronauts in 1965. They were testing cameras, photographing geological features for training purposes. When they passed over Mauritania, they saw concentric circles, perfect rings of light and dark stone, alternating, spreading outward from a central point. The formation was massive. The outer ring measured nearly 40 kilometers across, 25 miles in diameter. It looked artificial. It looked designed. It looked exactly like a target or a bullseye carved into the desert. For years, geologists assumed it was an impact crater, a meteor strike that created the circular pattern. But when they studied the rock composition, they found no evidence of impact. No shocked quartz, no meteorite fragments, no signs of the extreme pressure and heat that comes from cosmic collision. The rocks at Richat were ordinary sedimentary layers, Paleozoic dolomite and limestone, folded and eroded in a circular pattern. The current scientific consensus is that the Richat structure is a deeply eroded geological dome, molten rock pushed up from below, bulging the surface layers without breaking through. Over millions of years, erosion wore away the softer stone, leaving harder layers exposed as concentric ridges. The circular pattern is the result of differential erosion on a dome structure. Geology, not archaeology. Nature, not human hands. And that explanation works perfectly fine until you pull up Plato's description of Atlantis and start comparing measurements. In 2008, a German researcher named Michael Hübner did something methodical. He took every geographical detail Plato provided about Atlantis and created a weighted scoring system, location beyond the Pillars of Hercules. An island with concentric rings, mountains to the north. A rectangular plain, access to the sea. He searched for places on Earth that matched the criteria. The Richat structure scored higher than anywhere else he examined. By a significant margin, the dimensions matched. Plato said the central island was approximately 15 stadia across, roughly 1.7 miles, The central plateau of the Richat structure measures almost exactly that diameter. The alternating rings of land and water that Plato described? The Richat has alternating rings of different rock types forming ridges and valleys. If those valleys once held water, if this area was not desert but fertile land with rainfall and rivers, the structure would match Plato's account almost perfectly. The orientation matched. Plato said Atlantis had mountains to the north that sheltered it from cold winds. North of the Richat structure, there is a range of plateaus and elevated terrain, not massive mountains, but higher ground that would affect climate and wind patterns. And then there is the rectangular plain. Plato described a huge rectangular plain beyond the rings, measuring 3,000 stadia by 2,000 stadia. If you zoom out from the Richat structure on satellite imagery, you can see what looks like an ancient alluvial plain to the south. A relatively flat area that matches the proportions Plato gave. Michael Hubner presented his analysis quietly, in academic papers and a book that did not get much attention. But in 2018, someone else discovered the Richat structure and brought it to millions of people. His name is Jimmy Corsetti. He runs a YouTube channel called Bright Insight. He is a former Navy veteran and investigative researcher who became obsessed with ancient mysteries. In late 2018, he published a video proposing that the Richat structure was Atlantis. The video went viral. It has been viewed millions of times. It spawned hundreds of response videos, debates, analyses, and expeditions. Corsetti's argument was simple and visual. He showed side-by-side comparisons, Plato's description on one side, satellite images of the Richat on the other. The match was uncanny. He pointed out details that mainstream Atlantis researchers had missed or dismissed. He noted that ancient rivers once flowed near the structure, visible now only as dry channels in satellite photography. He showed how the Sahara was not always a desert, how it went through wet and dry cycles, how just a few thousand years ago this region would have been green. The response from professional archaeologists was swift and dismissive. The Richat structure is geology. It has been studied extensively. There is no archaeological evidence of any ancient city. The rocks are too old, dating back hundreds of millions of years to when the dome formed. No one has found tools, pottery, building foundations, or any sign of human habitation matching the timeline of a Bronze Age or Neolithic civilization. But here is what bothers me about the dismissal. It is true that no one has found archaeological evidence at Richat. It is also true that almost no one has looked. The structure is remote. It sits in a region with limited infrastructure, political instability, and extreme climate. Systematic archaeological excavation would require significant funding, international cooperation, and months or years of work in brutal conditions. Ground-penetrating radar surveys, careful stratigraphic analysis, the kind of methodical investigation that has uncovered hidden structures at other sites. That has not happened at Richat. What we have are geological surveys focused on understanding the rock formation, not archaeological surveys focused on finding evidence of human activity. We have satellite imagery analysis. We have some surface observations from researchers who visited briefly. But we do not have the kind of intensive excavation that would definitively prove or disprove human presence. So, when archaeologists say there is no evidence, what they mean is there is no evidence from the limited investigation that has occurred, which is not quite the same as proving no one ever lived there. Now let me tell you about the Green Sahara, because this is where the timeline starts to make sense. Between roughly 11,000 and 5,000 years ago, the Sahara Desert was not a desert. This period is called the African Humid Period, and it transformed North Africa. The monsoon rains shifted northward. Lakes formed across the Sahara. Vegetation covered areas that are now sand and rock. Animals migrated in. Hippos, crocodiles, elephants, and humans followed. We have proof of this. Satellite archaeology and radar surveys have detected ancient lake beds beneath the sand. The largest, Lake Megachad, covered an area larger than the Caspian Sea. Rock art across the Sahara shows people herding cattle, hunting wildlife, living in a landscape that looks nothing like the desert we see today. Pollen analysis from sediment cores confirms that the region supported grasslands and forests. Around 5,000 years ago, the rains stopped, the climate shifted again. The Sahara began its transformation back into desert. The lakes dried up. The rivers disappeared. The people who lived there migrated away toward the Nile Valley, toward the Mediterranean coast, toward wetter regions. If a civilization existed at the Richat structure during the Green Sahara period, it would have had water. It would have had agriculture. It would have been located in a habitable region, not the barren desert we see now. And when the climate shifted, when the water disappeared, the timeline matches the younger end of Plato's account if you assume he or his sources made errors with the numbers. 5,000 to 6,000 years ago is not 9,000 years before Solon, but it is ancient enough that records would be fragmentary, oral traditions would be distorted, and actual dates might be lost or confused. Some researchers have gone further. They have examined the river channels visible in satellite imagery near Richat. They claim some of these channels show signs of modification, of deliberate engineering to direct water flow. They point to anomalies in the landscape that might be buried structures. They suggest that beneath meters of accumulated sand, there could be archaeological remains waiting to be discovered. And maybe they are right. Or maybe they are seeing patterns that are not there. Wishful thinking projected onto geology. This is where I get stuck. This is where I want to believe, and know I should not, because the Richat structure looks so much like what Plato described that it feels impossible. The measurements match, the structure matches, the orientation matches, even the geological setting, if you account for climate change, matches. It is as if someone took Plato's text, found the best match on Earth, and there it was, sitting in the Sahara, visible from space, but we have no pottery, no tools, no walls, no foundations, no harbour installations, no inscriptions, nothing that would definitively say people lived here, let alone built a city here. Let alone built the city Plato described. We have a shape that matches. We do not have proof. And here is the tragedy. If Atlantis really was at the Richat structure, if a civilization thrived here during the wet Sahara period, then the evidence is buried, covered by thousands of years of sand and erosion, waiting for someone with resources and permission and determination to excavate. But that probably will not happen, because mainstream archaeology does not take Atlantis seriously. Funding agencies will not invest in searching for a mythical city. Permission to excavate in Mauritania is difficult to obtain, and the few researchers passionate enough to try are dismissed as pseudoscientists chasing fantasy. So the Richat structure sits there, an eye in the desert, a geological curiosity that might be the greatest archaeological site never excavated. Or it might be just rocks. Erosion and time creating a pattern that happens to match an ancient story. Sometimes the most frustrating mysteries are the ones we can see but cannot touch, the ones where all the pieces seem to fit, where the evidence whispers maybe, but we cannot dig deep enough to hear it clearly. I do not know if Atlantis was at the eye of the Sahara, but I know that every time I look at satellite images of those concentric rings, I feel the pull, the same pull that has kept people searching for 24 centuries, the pull of something that might be true, if only we could prove it. Here is what keeps me up at night. Not one anomaly. The way certain themes repeat across cultures that supposedly never met, across timelines that should not connect, across continents separated by oceans. Let me show you what I mean. In 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt started excavating a hill in southeastern Turkey called Göbekli Tepe. Local people had known about the site for years. There were stones sticking out of the ground, arranged in patterns. Most assumed it was a medieval cemetery. Schmidt thought it might be older. He was right. But he had no idea how much older. The first radiocarbon dates came back around 9,600 BC. Schmidt thought there was an error. He tested again. Same result. He brought in additional teams. They confirmed it. Göbekli Tepe was built at the end of the last ice age, roughly 11,600 years ago. This should not be possible according to everything we thought we knew about human civilization. The site consists of massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some weighing over 16 tons, arranged in circular enclosures. The pillars are decorated with carved reliefs showing animals, foxes, snakes, scorpions, vultures, wild boars. The carving is sophisticated, detailed, artistic. These were not crude scratchings. These were craftsmen who understood form and proportion. But here is the problem. 11,600 years ago, humans were not supposed to be building monuments. We were hunter-gatherers. We had not invented agriculture yet. We had not domesticated animals. We lived in small mobile groups, following game, gathering plants, moving seasonally. We did not build permanent structures, let alone megalithic temples with astronomical alignments and artistic programs. Göbekli Tepe overturned that entire narrative in a single discovery. Schmidt spent the rest of his life excavating the site. When he died in 2014, less than 5% had been uncovered. Ground-penetrating radar suggests there are at least 20 circular enclosures still buried. The site covers 22 acres. What we have excavated is the tip of something much larger. And it gets stranger. The oldest structures at Göbekli Tepe are the most sophisticated. The later enclosures show declining craftsmanship. The pillars get smaller. The carvings become less detailed. It is as if the builders forgot how to build, as if they were copying something they no longer fully understood. Then there is the question of labor. Moving 16-ton stones without wheels, without domesticated animals, without metal tools, requires organization. It requires hundreds of people working together. It requires a social structure complex enough to coordinate large-scale projects. Where did that organization come from? How did hunter-gatherers develop it? The mainstream explanation is that we were wrong about hunter-gatherers. They were more sophisticated than we assumed. Göbekli Tepe proves that monumental architecture came before agriculture, not after. Religion motivated construction. Spiritual belief created the labor organization that eventually led to settled farming communities. And maybe that is true. Maybe we just underestimated what small groups of motivated people could accomplish. But it does not explain why the oldest is the best. It does not explain why skill declined over time. And it does not explain what happened to the knowledge that built Göbekli Tepe, because 1,000 years later, humans in that region were building much simpler structures. Now let me take you to the Andes, to Bolivia, to a place called Puma Punku. Puma Punku is part of a larger archaeological complex near Lake Titicaca, sitting at an altitude of 12,800 feet. The site dates to around 550 AD, according to conventional chronology, though some researchers argue it could be older based on weathering patterns and astronomical alignments. What makes Puma Punku remarkable is the precision. The stone blocks are cut from andesite and diorite, some of the hardest rocks on Earth. They are shaped with perfect right angles, smooth surfaces, and complex interlocking designs. Some blocks have H-shaped grooves that fit together like Lego pieces. The tolerances are so tight that you cannot slide a piece of paper between the joints. This is Bronze Age technology, cutting stones that modern stonemasons would struggle to reproduce without diamond saws and computer-guided equipment. The blocks weigh up to 800 tons. They were quarried from mountains 10 miles away, transported across rough terrain, lifted to altitude, and assembled with precision that suggests sophisticated engineering knowledge. No mortar, no obvious tool marks, just perfectly fitted stones that have survived centuries of earthquakes. Mainstream archaeology says the Tiwanaku civilization that built Puma Punku used bronze chisels, stone hammers, and patience. Lots of patience. They moved the blocks using rope, wooden rollers, and massive labor forces. The precision came from skilled craftsmen who spent lifetimes perfecting their techniques. And maybe that is true. Humans are capable of extraordinary things given enough time and motivation. But then you look at the blocks themselves. Some show evidence of machining, of cutting patterns that look like they came from rotary tools. Some have drill holes that appear to have been made with tubular drills, requiring sustained rotational force. The surface polish on some stones exceeds what you would expect from hand grinding. Engineers who have studied the site say the construction techniques do not match known Bronze Age capabilities. The precision is off. The methods do not make sense. It looks more like industrial fabrication than ancient stonework. Is it possible a pre-Columbian civilization developed advanced construction techniques that were later lost? Yes. Is it possible we are misidentifying natural tool marks as evidence of impossible technology? Also yes. Is it possible something else was happening at Pumapunku that we do not understand yet? That option remains open. Across the ocean in Lebanon, there is another impossibility called Baalbek. It is massive and impressive, the kind of monumental architecture Rome was famous for. But the Romans built their temple on top of something older. The foundation of the Temple of Jupiter sits on enormous stone blocks called the Trilithon. 3 stones, each weighing approximately 800 tons, they were quarried half a mile away, transported uphill, and placed with such precision that the joints are nearly invisible. These stones were already ancient when the Romans arrived. No one knows who cut them or how they were moved. There is another stone still in the quarry called the Stone of the Pregnant Woman. It weighs approximately 1,000 tons and was partially carved but never transported. Modern crane technology can lift maybe 800 tons under ideal conditions. Whatever civilization carved that stone had engineering capabilities that rival or exceed our own. Roman historians wrote about Baalbek. They did not claim to have built the foundation. They said they built their temple on older ruins, on foundations laid by earlier civilizations, but they did not say who those civilizations were. And then there is Yonaguni, an underwater formation off the coast of Japan that may or may not be the most controversial archaeological site in the world. In 1987, a dive instructor named Kihachiro Aratake discovered a massive stepped structure underwater near Yonaguni Island. The formation has straight edges, right angles, flat surfaces, and what appear to be carved channels and terraces. It looks like a submerged pyramid or temple complex. Marine geologist Masaki Kimura spent over 15 years studying the site. He believes it is man-made, carved from natural rock and modified by human hands. He points to features that seem too regular to be natural: tool marks, drainage channels, post holes, a face carved into stone. Other geologists disagree. They say Yonaguni is natural sandstone shaped by tectonic activity and erosion. Sandstone fractures in straight lines. Water erosion can create flat terraces. The formation looks artificial, but is actually geology doing what geology does, creating patterns that fool our pattern-seeking brains. The debate has continued for over 30 years with no resolution. What makes it relevant to Atlantis is the timeline. If Yonaguni is man-made, it was carved when the area was above water, before post-glacial sea level rise submerged it. That would date it to at least 10,000 years ago, possibly much older. A monument that old, that sophisticated, built by a culture we have no other record of, would rewrite everything we think we know about human civilization in East Asia. Here is the pattern I keep seeing: Göbekli Tepe, Pumapunku, Baalbek, Yonaguni. These sites share commonalities that make me uncomfortable. They involve megalithic construction that seems too advanced for their supposed time period. They are often coastal or island locations, or they were coastal before sea levels changed. Many show evidence of water damage or were actually submerged. They demonstrate engineering knowledge that appears then disappears, leaving no clear technological lineage. And here is what really bothers me. When archaeologists encounter these sites, the response is always the same. We underestimated ancient people. They were more capable than we thought. With enough time and labor, humans can accomplish almost anything. That explanation works for one site, maybe two, but when the pattern repeats across continents, across cultures that supposedly never had contact, across timelines that span thousands of years, the explanation starts to feel insufficient. I am not saying ancient aliens built these structures. I am not saying there was a global advanced civilization with lost technology. I am saying the pattern exists. It is real, and our current explanations do not fully account for it. The simplest explanation, the one archaeologists prefer, is independent development. Different cultures, facing similar challenges, came up with similar solutions. Humans everywhere figured out how to move big stones because moving big stones is impressive and useful. The precision developed through trial and error. The knowledge was lost when civilizations collapsed or priorities changed. Occam's razor suggests we should accept that explanation. The simplest answer is usually correct. But here is my question. Is it really simpler to propose that dozens of unconnected cultures independently developed sophisticated megalithic construction techniques that were then independently lost? Or is it simpler to propose that maybe, just maybe, there was knowledge transmission we do not see in the archaeological record? I used to think ancient people could not do these things. Then I learned they did. The question is not whether they could. The question is how, and whether they learned from someone who came before. Because if there was a maritime civilization before the Younger Dryas, before the flooding, before the climate catastrophe, and if that civilization had advanced construction knowledge, and if fragments of that knowledge survived through oral tradition or direct contact with successor cultures, then the pattern makes sense. We would expect to see sophisticated techniques appearing in different regions. We would expect to see the knowledge declining over time as it was imperfectly copied. We would expect to see coastal and island locations because that is where the original civilization would have thrived. We would expect confusion about dates because the knowledge would be older than the structures. I am not saying that is what happened. I am saying it is a hypothesis that explains the data as well as independent development does. Maybe better. And the fact that mainstream archaeology will not seriously consider it, will not even entertain it as a working hypothesis, makes me wonder what we are missing by insisting the timeline we have is the only possible timeline. History is not a straight line upward. It is a wave. With crests, we have forgotten. 12,800 years ago, the world was warming, the Ice Age was ending, glaciers were retreating, sea levels were rising, megafauna were spreading into new territories, early humans were beginning to settle, to experiment with cultivating wild grains, to build more permanent structures, and then, suddenly, violently, the temperature dropped. In some regions, average temperatures fell 15 degrees Celsius in less than a decade. In Greenland, ice core analysis shows drops of up to 22 degrees Fahrenheit happening within a single year. Not over centuries. Not gradually. Within 12 months, the climate shifted from warming to deep cold. Glaciers that had been retreating began advancing again. Forests died. Lakes froze. The warming trend that had been underway for thousands of years simply stopped, as if someone had thrown a switch. This period is called the Younger Dryas, and it lasted approximately 1,200 years. From 12,800 years ago until 11,600 years ago, the Earth experienced a climate reversal so severe that it killed off species that had survived the entire Ice Age. Woolly mammoths, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, American camels and horses, mastodons. In North America alone, 34 genera of large mammals went extinct. Not just individual species. Entire categories of animals disappeared. The Clovis culture, the earliest widespread human culture in the Americas, collapsed. Archaeological sites show sudden abandonment. The distinctive Clovis spear points stop appearing in the geological record. Population levels crashed. For decades, climate scientists had an explanation. They proposed that massive meltwater from retreating glaciers disrupted ocean circulation patterns, particularly the Gulf Stream. Without warm water flowing north, temperatures in the northern hemisphere dropped. A feedback loop kicked in. More ice meant more sunlight reflected back to space. More reflection meant colder temperatures. Colder temperatures meant more ice. It was a tidy explanation. It fit the gradualist model of geological change that has dominated science since Charles Lyell in the 1800s. Change happens slowly, through processes we can observe today. No catastrophes needed. And then, in 2007, a team of scientists published a paper that suggested something else entirely. The lead author was Richard Firestone from Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. He was joined by over 24 researchers from multiple institutions. Their paper proposed that a comet or asteroid impacted or exploded over North America at the start of the Younger Dryas, triggering the climate reversal, causing the megafauna extinctions, and collapsing human populations. The evidence they presented was specific. They had found a boundary layer in sediment cores across North America and Europe, dated precisely to 12,800 years ago. This layer contained materials that should not be there. Magnetic microspherules, the kind created when rock is vaporized by extreme heat and then condenses. Nanodiamonds, formed under intense pressure, carbon spherules, indicating massive wildfires, and a spike in platinum, an element rare on Earth's surface but common in asteroids and comets. They found this boundary layer at 50 different sites across North America, from California to the Great Lakes, from Mexico to Canada. The same signature, the same date, the same evidence of catastrophic heating and impact. The scientific response was immediate and hostile. Critics said the evidence was contaminated. They said the nanodiamonds were misidentified. They said the platinum spike could be explained by other processes. They said extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and this evidence was not extraordinary enough. The impact hypothesis was dismissed by most of the geological community. It became associated with fringe science, with catastrophism, with people who wanted to believe in ancient apocalypses rather than accept gradual change. But the evidence kept accumulating. In 2019, researchers analyzing material from Abu Huraira, an archaeological site in Syria, found something undeniable. The site had a layer of melt glass, material formed when sand or soil is subjected to temperatures exceeding 2,200 degrees Celsius. You cannot get those temperatures from a normal fire. You cannot get them from volcanism in that region. You can get them from three things: lightning strikes, nuclear explosions, or cosmic impacts. Abu Huraira is not volcanic. And the amount of melt glass was far too extensive for lightning. The researchers who analyzed it concluded that the site had been exposed to a thermal pulse consistent with an airburst or impact event, and the date matched the Younger Dryas boundary. Also, in 2019, another team published evidence of platinum anomalies in ice cores from Greenland, not just at sites where ground sediment could be contaminated, but in ice deposited from the atmosphere 12,800 years ago. The platinum spike was global. Then in 2018, a research team using ice-penetrating radar announced they had found a massive impact crater beneath the Hiawatha Glacier in northwestern Greenland. The crater measures 31 kilometers across. It is buried under ice, up to 1 kilometer thick. The dating is uncertain because you cannot easily sample bedrock under that much ice, but preliminary analysis suggests it could be from the late Pleistocene. A 31-kilometer crater means an impactor roughly 1.5 kilometers in diameter. That is not dinosaur killer size, but it is civilization ending size for anything in the impact zone and climate-altering size globally. And there may be more. Some researchers propose that what hit Earth was not a single object but a fragmented comet, multiple pieces striking different locations. That would explain the widespread evidence. That would explain why the effects were global rather than regional. Randall Carlson, a geological researcher who has spent decades studying catastrophic flooding in North America, has documented evidence that massive glacial outburst floods occurred at the Younger Dryas boundary. The channeled scablands in Washington state show signs of flooding so violent it stripped away hundreds of feet of bedrock, carved channels 40 miles wide, and moved boulders the size of houses. Carlson argues that if a comet airburst or impact occurred over the ice sheet covering North America, the thermal pulse would have instantly melted enormous quantities of ice. The resulting floods would have been biblical in scale, walls of water hundreds of feet high, carrying ice and debris, obliterating everything in their path. The floodwaters would have poured into the oceans, raising sea levels rapidly. Coastal communities would have been inundated. Islands would have been submerged. Any civilization living on the coast or on low-lying islands would have been destroyed. Now let me connect this to Atlantis. Plato said Atlantis was destroyed 9,000 years before Solon visited Egypt around 590 BC. 9,000 years before 590 BC puts the date around 9500 BC. The Younger Dryas boundary is dated to approximately 10,800 BC. These numbers are in the same ballpark. Not exact, but close. If the Egyptian priests who told Solon the story were working from oral traditions or partially damaged records, if they were approximating dates from their own chronology, an error of 1,000 years is entirely plausible. What if Atlantis was not destroyed by routine earthquakes and floods? What if it was destroyed by the Younger Dryas catastrophe? By the impacts, the climate reversal, the flooding, the collapse of ecosystems worldwide, that would explain why no one else remembered it. Because everyone was dealing with their own catastrophe. Because civilizations across the globe were collapsing. Because the survivors were focused on survival, not record keeping. And here is what makes this timeline genuinely eerie. Flood myths appear in cultures around the world. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes a flood sent by the gods that destroys humanity, except for one family who builds a boat. The biblical story of Noah describes the same thing. Greek mythology has Deucalion's flood. Hindu texts describe a great flood where Manu is warned by a fish to build a boat. Chinese mythology has Gunyu and the Great Flood. Native American tribes across North America have flood traditions. Most archaeologists treat these as independent myths, addressing universal human fears about water and destruction. But what if they are fragmented memories of the same event? What if cultures around the world remember the Younger Dryas flooding because it actually happened to their ancestors? The Black Sea deluge, which we discussed earlier, happened around 5600 BC. That is thousands of years after the Younger Dryas. But there were multiple flooding events as ice sheets melted and sea levels rose. The Younger Dryas was the first major catastrophe. Later floods would have reinforced the cultural memory, kept the stories alive. If Atlantis existed before the Younger Dryas, if it was a coastal or island civilization, somewhere in the Atlantic or Mediterranean, and if it was destroyed by the impacts and flooding, then Plato's account is not mythology. It is the last written record of an event that destroyed the world as it existed then. The more I learn about what happened 12,800 years ago, the less crazy Atlantis sounds, the less it feels like a philosopher's invention, and the more it feels like a scar in human memory. Because here is what we know for certain. Something catastrophic happened at the Younger Dryas boundary. The evidence is real. The extinction is documented. The climate reversal is in the ice cores. The impact markers are in the sediment. The flooding carved landscapes we can still see. We know the world ended. At least, a version of the world ended. The Pleistocene world, the Ice Age world, the world of megafauna and early human expansion. That world was destroyed. And, if there were sophisticated human societies at that time, societies that had developed agriculture or architecture or navigation, they were destroyed too. Their cities are underwater now. Their records are gone. Their descendants became survivors, refugees, people who remembered something about the before times but could not prove it. Maybe we are not looking for a place anymore. Maybe we are looking for a moment. A time when we had achieved something, built something, knew something, and then it was taken away. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis is still controversial. Many geologists remain skeptical, but the evidence keeps mounting. More crater discoveries, more boundary layer analysis, more confirmation that something extraordinary happened. And if it happened, if Earth was struck by comet fragments 12,800 years ago, then every coastal civilization on the planet would have been vulnerable. Every island, every river delta, every harbor city. Atlantis would not have been the only victim. It would have been one victim among many. The one we remember because Plato wrote it down, because Egyptian priests kept the story, because it had just enough detail to tantalize us across millennia. The smoking gun may not be a sunken city. It may be a layer of ash and diamonds in the soil, marking the day the sky fell. What keeps me curious is not whether Atlantis had flying cars or laser beams, or any of the science fiction technology that gets projected onto ancient civilizations. What keeps me curious is whether they understood things we had to relearn, whether knowledge we think of as modern was actually discovered, lost, and then discovered again. Let me show you what I mean. In 1900, sponge divers working off the Greek island of Antikythera discovered a Roman shipwreck. The ship had sunk around 70 BC, carrying bronze statues, pottery, glassware, luxury goods bound for Rome. Among the artifacts, divers found a corroded lump of bronze and wood that no one paid much attention to. It sat in a museum storage room for decades. Then, in the 1950s, a physicist named Derek de Solla Price started examining it closely. As the corrosion was carefully removed and X-ray analysis became available, something impossible emerged. The device contained at least 30 interlocking bronze gears of different sizes, arranged in a complex mechanism. The gears had triangular teeth, precisely cut and fitted. There were inscriptions in ancient Greek describing astronomical phenomena. There were dial faces showing the movements of the sun, moon, and planets. It was an analog computer, a mechanical device for calculating astronomical positions and predicting eclipses, and it was built around 150 BC, possibly earlier. The Antikythera mechanism is the most sophisticated piece of technology we have from the ancient world. Nothing else comes close. It would not be matched in complexity until mechanical clocks appeared in 14th century Europe. That is a gap of over 1,400 years. When researchers finally reconstructed how it worked, they found it could predict the positions of the sun and moon with remarkable accuracy. It could calculate the phases of the moon. It tracked the metonic cycle, the 19-year pattern when lunar phases repeat on the same calendar dates. It predicted solar and lunar eclipses, including the Saros cycle that eclipse predictions rely on. This was not a simple device. This required understanding of astronomy, mathematics, and precision metalworking that we assume did not exist in the ancient world. The gear teeth were shaped to compensate for the elliptical orbit of the moon, incorporating an understanding of lunar motion that we credit to Johannes Kepler in the 1600s. And here is the disturbing part. We only know the Antikythera mechanism existed because a shipwreck happened to preserve it, and sponge divers happened to find it. If that ship had not sunk, if the bronze had been recycled, like most ancient metalwork was, we would have no idea that ancient Greeks were building analog computers. How many other devices like this existed? How much knowledge was lost when libraries burned, when civilizations fell, when metal was melted down for reuse? The answer is we do not know. We only know what survived. And survival is largely random. There is a pillar in Delhi, India, standing in the courtyard of the Qutb complex. It is made of iron. It was erected around 400 AD, possibly earlier. It stands 23 feet tall and weighs over 6 tons, and after 1,600 years exposed to monsoon rains and humidity, it has barely rusted. Modern iron would be a pile of rust flakes after that much time. The Delhi iron pillar has a thin, protective layer of misawatite, a compound that forms from the specific phosphorus content in the iron, but creating that composition requires metallurgical knowledge that we thought did not develop until much later. The pillar represents a technique that was achieved, then lost, then not fully understood again until modern materials science. Roman concrete is another example. The Romans built harbours, aqueducts, and buildings from concrete that has lasted 2,000 years. The Pantheon Dome in Rome, built around 120 AD, is still the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world. It has survived earthquakes, floods, and millennia of weather. Modern concrete begins to degrade after decades. Reinforced concrete bridges built in the 1960s are already crumbling and need replacement. Yet Roman harbour installations, submerged in seawater for 2,000 years, are still intact. For centuries, we did not know how they did it. We assumed Roman concrete was inferior to modern concrete. Then researchers started analysing the chemistry. They found the Romans used volcanic ash, specifically a type from Pozzuoli near Naples, that reacts with seawater to create crystalline structures that actually strengthen over time. They had developed a self-healing concrete. We lost that knowledge. For over 1,000 years, we built with inferior materials because we had forgotten what the Romans knew. In the Mediterranean island of Malta, there is an underground chamber called the Hypogeum of Alsaflieni. It was carved from limestone bedrock around 3,600 BC. The chamber has acoustic properties that modern architects struggle to explain. If you speak at a certain spot in the oracle room, the sound resonates at exactly 110 Hz. That frequency is known to affect human brain activity. It can induce altered states of consciousness. The chamber was engineered, deliberately shaped to create this resonance. Neolithic people, working with stone tools, carved a space with acoustic properties that require sophisticated understanding of sound waves and resonance. This was not accidental. This was knowledge applied intentionally. And then there are examples that are less about physical technology and more about intellectual achievement. In 240 BC, A Greek mathematician named Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth using shadows and geometry. He was accurate to within 2% of the actual value. He did this without satellites, without modern surveying equipment, without traveling more than a few hundred miles. He used observations, mathematics, and reasoning, and he got it right. How many other calculations like this were made and lost? How much astronomical knowledge, geographical knowledge, mathematical knowledge existed and disappeared when libraries burned or civilizations collapsed? The Library of Alexandria, at its peak, may have held 400,000 to 700,000 scrolls. Almost none survived. We have fragments, references in other texts, hints of what was there, but the knowledge itself is gone. When the library burned, and it burned multiple times over several centuries, we lost works by hundreds of authors we know existed but have never read. We lost scientific treatises, geographical surveys, historical chronicles. We lost the accumulated knowledge of Greek, Egyptian, and Near Eastern civilizations. What if some of that knowledge included records of civilizations older than Egypt? What if the Egyptian priests who spoke to Solon had access to documents that later burned? What if the Atlantis story was preserved because it was written down multiple times, in multiple places, and one of those copies happened to reach Plato? This is where I start to question the assumption of linear progress. We are taught that human knowledge accumulates, that we build on what came before, always moving forward, always discovering more. And in general, that is true. But the timeline is not smooth. There are gaps, there are reversals, there are moments when knowledge was lost and had to be rediscovered. After the fall of Rome, Europe entered what historians politely call the early medieval period, and everyone else calls the Dark Ages. Literacy declined, engineering knowledge was lost, architectural techniques were forgotten, aqueducts stopped being maintained, roads fell into disrepair, glassmaking became a lost art in many regions. It took centuries to recover. The Renaissance was named that rebirth because Europeans were literally rediscovering knowledge from Greek and Roman sources that had been preserved in Islamic libraries while Europe forgot. If a dark age can happen over a few centuries, what could happen over a few millennia? If there were sophisticated societies before the Younger Dryas, before the flooding, and if those societies were destroyed, how much of their knowledge would survive? Not their buildings, which would be underwater or buried, not their books, which would decay, not their tools, which would be scavenged and recycled. What would survive is knowledge that could be passed down orally. Stories, astronomical observations encoded in myth, mathematical principles embedded in religious practices, navigation techniques taught father to son, architectural proportions preserved in sacred geometry. And that is exactly what we find. Cultures around the world with astronomical knowledge they should not have, building techniques that seem too advanced, mathematical constants appearing in structures whose builders we assume were primitive. I am not saying ancient Atlanteans taught everyone how to build pyramids. I am saying knowledge transmission happens in ways we do not always see in the archaeological record. A sailor from one culture meets a sailor from another, and the origin gets lost while the knowledge remains. The Antikythera mechanism proves that ancient Greeks had technological capabilities we did not know about until we found physical evidence. The Delhi iron pillar proves metallurgical knowledge was achieved and then lost. Roman concrete proves engineering techniques disappeared and had to be rediscovered. These are not theories, these are documented facts. So when I ask whether Atlantis or some other advanced ancient civilization might have existed, I am not asking whether they had impossible technology. I am asking whether they had knowledge that was later lost, whether they understood astronomy, engineering, navigation, agriculture, at levels that were not preserved in the archaeological record we have found so far. The older I get, the less I assume we are the first to be clever. The more I learn about what has been lost and rediscovered, the more I wonder what else we lost that we have not rediscovered yet. Maybe there are no ancient computers waiting to be excavated. Maybe there are no advanced power sources buried beneath the sand. But maybe there were people who looked at the stars and understood the cycles, who looked at stone and knew how to move it, who looked at the ocean and knew how to cross it. and maybe some of what they knew died with them when the world changed. That knowledge gap, that possibility that we are rebuilding something that was built before, not flying cars. Just the humbling thought that maybe we are not as original as we think. I have been researching this for months now, and I finally realized something. I am not looking for an island. I am looking for proof that humanity was once better than this, that we came from greatness instead of stumbling into it by accident. And I think that is what most of us are really searching for when we search for Atlantis. The myth has endured for 24 centuries, not because the evidence is compelling, though sometimes it is, but because the story fulfills needs we do not always acknowledge. Deep needs. Human needs. The need to believe we are part of something larger than ourselves. The need to believe that wisdom and sophistication existed before us. The need to believe that what has been lost can be found again. Let me show you how this works. In 1626, Francis Bacon published a book called New Atlantis. It described a utopian society on a fictional island in the Pacific, a place where science and reason guided governance, where knowledge was pursued for the betterment of humanity. Bacon was not trying to find Plato's Atlantis. He was using the name as a symbol, a representation of what society could become if it organized itself around wisdom and learning. The book was enormously influential. It helped shape Enlightenment thinking. It inspired the founding of scientific societies. The Royal Society of London cited Bacon's vision as part of their intellectual foundation. But notice what happened. Bacon took Atlantis, a story about a civilization destroyed by its own hubris, and transformed it into a symbol of hope and progress. He kept the name, changed the meaning, and created something that served the psychological needs of his era. In 1882, an American writer named Ignatius Donnelly published Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. Donnelly was a congressman, a populist, someone who distrusted established power structures. His book argued that Atlantis was real, that it was the origin point for all human civilization, that ancient cultures around the world were connected through this lost motherland. He presented charts comparing Egyptian and Mayan pyramids. He catalogued flood myths from different cultures. He created an elaborate theory connecting archaeological mysteries through a single lost civilization. The book became a bestseller. It went through multiple editions. It inspired generations of alternative historians, and it did so not because Donnelly presented airtight evidence, but because he told people what they wanted to hear, that mainstream academics were wrong, that ancient people were more sophisticated than historians claimed, that there were hidden truths waiting to be discovered by those brave enough to question authority. The Theosophical Society, founded by Madame Blavatsky, incorporated Atlantis into their mystical teachings. They claimed Atlanteans were spiritually advanced beings with psychic powers. They said Atlantis existed on a higher plane of consciousness, and its destruction was a spiritual lesson about materialism and pride. In the 1930s, the Nazi Ahnenerbe, Hitler's archaeological research organization, sent expeditions searching for Atlantis. They believed it was the homeland of the Aryan race, that finding it would prove their theories about racial superiority and ancient Germanic glory. After World War II, the New Age movement adopted Atlantis as a symbol of ancient wisdom, crystal power, and spiritual enlightenment. Psychics claimed to channel Atlantean spirits. Authors wrote books about Atlantean healing techniques and energy work. Notice the pattern. Every era, every movement, every ideology that needs an origin story or a validation of their worldview finds a way to make Atlantis fit. The story is endlessly adaptable. It can be whatever we need it to be. For Francis Bacon, it was rational utopia. For Donnelly, it was proof that authorities lie and common people can discover truth. For Theosophists, it was spiritual enlightenment. For Nazis, it was racial mythology. And for many people today, it represents distrust of mainstream narratives. The feeling that we are not being told the full story about human history. The suspicion that archaeologists and historians have agendas, that they protect orthodoxy rather than pursue truth. This is not entirely unfair. Academic consensus does sometimes resist new evidence. Paradigm shifts. Researchers who challenge established timelines face skepticism and career consequences. The story of Göbekli Tepe proves that sometimes the mainstream is wrong about what ancient people could accomplish. But here is where it gets complicated. The fact that mainstream archaeology has been wrong about some things does not mean it is wrong about everything. The fact that ancient people were more sophisticated than we assumed does not prove every alternative theory is correct. Atlantis has become a symbol for people who feel alienated from institutional authority, who feel that experts dismiss their questions, who want to believe there is hidden knowledge, suppressed truth, mysteries that only independent thinkers can solve. And I understand that feeling. I have it myself sometimes. The pull toward the alternative explanation, the satisfaction of questioning consensus, the thrill of thinking you see something others miss. But we have to be honest about what we are doing. We are not just searching for a lost city. We are searching for meaning. We are searching for connection to something ancient and wise. We are searching for proof that humanity has deep roots, that we are not just clever apes who got lucky, that somewhere in our past there was greatness worth recovering. Carl Jung wrote about the collective unconscious, the idea that certain symbols and stories recur across cultures because they tap into something fundamental in human psychology. He identified archetypes, patterns that appear in myths worldwide. The Great Mother, the hero's journey, the fall from grace. Atlantis fits the archetype of the Golden Age. The paradise, lost. The time before corruption, when humans lived in harmony with nature and each other, when wisdom guided action, when life was simpler and better. Every culture has this story. The Greeks had the Golden Age of Cronus before Zeus took power. The Egyptians had Zep Tepi, the first time, when gods walked among humans. Aboriginal Australians have the dream time. Christians have Eden. Hindus have the Satya Yuga. We keep recreating the story because we need it. We need to believe we came from somewhere better. That decline is not inevitable. That if we fell from grace, we can climb back up. Maybe Atlantis is not a place. Maybe it is an idea. The idea that humanity was once whole, once wise, once living correctly, and that we can recover what was lost if we search hard enough. And maybe the search itself is the point. Maybe what matters is not finding Atlantis, but the act of looking. The questions we ask, the humility we develop when we realize how much we do not know, the wonder we feel when we look at ancient ruins and recognize the humanity in people who lived thousands of years ago. I do not know if Atlantis was real. After all this research, after all these hours spent reading papers and examining evidence and trying to be fair to all sides, I still do not know. And I think I am okay with that. Because what I have learned is not whether an island sank in the Atlantic. What I have learned is that humans have always told stories about who we were and who we might become. That we use the past to make sense of the present. That we project our hopes and fears onto ancient mysteries. Atlantis is a mirror. When you look at it, you see yourself, your desires, your doubts, your need for wonder in a world that often feels too small and too known. Maybe that is enough. Maybe the story does not need to be true to be valuable. Maybe wandering together, across generations and cultures, is its own kind of truth. The hours I have spent thinking about this, reading, researching, wondering, those hours were not wasted because I did not find a definitive answer. They were time spent in awe, time spent feeling connected to everyone else who ever looked at the ocean and wondered what lies beneath. You do not have to solve it. You can just sit with it. And maybe, in letting go of the need for answers, you find something more valuable. The humility to live with uncertainty, the patience to keep wondering, the companionship of shared curiosity. That might be the real treasure Atlantis offers. Not gold or lost technology. Sometimes I walk along a beach and think about the people who walked here when it wasn't a beach at all, when this was inland, when the ocean was miles away, when what is now underwater was forest or grassland or someone's home. The waves erase footprints within minutes, but the ocean has been erasing landscapes for thousands of years, and we barely notice. Since the end of the last ice age, sea levels have risen approximately 400 feet. That number is so large it becomes abstract. Let me make it concrete. 400 feet is taller than a 30-story building. It is the height of the Great Pyramid at Giza. It is deep enough to completely submerge every coastal city that existed 20,000 years ago, along with their harbors, their farmland, their sacred sites, their dead, the continental shelves, the shallow underwater plateaus surrounding every continent were dry land during the Ice Age. People lived there. We know this because occasionally fishing trawlers pull up stone tools or mammoth bones from the seafloor. We know this because underwater surveys keep finding submerged river valleys that once flowed through inhabited landscapes. But we have mapped less than 20% of the ocean floor in any detail. We have seriously explored, with human eyes or robots, maybe 5%. The rest is silence. Cold, dark, pressurized silence. There are cities down there that we have found purely by accident. Herakleion, off the coast of Egypt, was a major port city where Cleopatra was crowned. It was mentioned in ancient texts. Herodotus wrote about it. And then it vanished. For over 1,000 years, historians assumed the city was mythological or the location was wrong. In 2000, underwater archaeologist Frank Goddio found it beneath 30 feet of sediment in Abu Qir Bay. Temples, statues, sphinxes, the foundations of an entire city preserved in mud. Pavlopetri, off the southern coast of Greece, is even older. It dates to around 3000 BC, making it possibly the oldest submerged city ever discovered. It was found in 1967 by a tourist who noticed shapes underwater while swimming. Just chance. Someone happened to look down at the right moment, in the right place. Off the coast of India, near the city of Dwarka, divers have found submerged structures that may be the remains of a city mentioned in Hindu texts. The explorations are ongoing, controversial, underfunded. The visibility is poor. Excavating underwater is brutally expensive and technically difficult. And these are the cities we found accidentally, in relatively shallow water, in areas where people were looking for other things. What about the cities we have not found? What about settlements that existed on the continental shelf when sea levels were 400 feet lower? If they were built from wood, they are gone. If they were built from stone, they are buried under centuries of sediment. If they were important enough that someone might search for them, we would need to know exactly where to look in millions of square miles of seafloor. The mathematics of loss are devastating. If early coastal civilizations existed before the Holocene, before the Great Melting, more than 95% of their archaeological evidence would now be underwater. Not just buried, but in locations we have no reason to search because we do not know they existed. This is not speculation. This is simple geography. Humans have always preferred coastal locations, river mouths, natural harbors, fertile deltas. Those locations are now submerged. If Neolithic or Mesolithic people built anything permanent on Ice Age coastlines, we will never find it unless we get extraordinarily lucky, or unless we develop technology that can scan the entire continental shelf. Neither is likely to happen. Underwater archaeology is among the most expensive forms of research. You need ships, submersibles, specialized equipment, expert divers, months of work in difficult conditions. A single season of excavation can cost millions. Most archaeological projects struggle to get $50,000 in funding. So the silence continues. The ocean keeps its secrets. And we live on shorelines that are graveyards of former worlds. Doggerland did not vanish in a day. It drowned slowly, over 6,000 years. Imagine that. Generations living in the same place, watching the water creep closer. Your great-grandparents remember when you could walk to what is now an island. Your grandparents remember forests that are now tidal marsh. Your parents remember the old fishing grounds that are now too deep to reach. You watch the sea take everything you know, not suddenly, not catastrophically, but inexorably. One storm pushes the water a little higher. The sacred grove where your ancestors are buried floods during high tide. You adapt. You move inland. You rebuild. Your children think of the drowned lands as legends. Their children think of them as myths. And eventually, no one remembers that the world was ever different. That is what water does. It does not just take land. It takes memory. What haunts me is not what we have lost. What haunts me is that we will never know we lost it. There could be architecture beneath the North Sea that would rewrite our understanding of Neolithic Europe. There could be harbors off the coast of India that would prove sophisticated maritime cultures existed millennia earlier than we think. There could be an entire city on the Atlantic shelf that matches every detail Plato described, and unless someone happens to point a sonar array at exactly the right coordinates, it will remain undiscovered forever. The ocean is not hostile, it is indifferent. It covers, it preserves in some ways, it destroys in others, and it keeps what it takes. Every artifact we have from the ancient world is an accident of survival. The right materials in the right conditions in a location that happened to be accessible when someone happened to be looking. We build theories about ancient civilizations based on what survived. But survival is not representative. It is random. What if the most sophisticated cultures of the ancient world were coastal traders? What if they built primarily from wood? What if their cities are now 300 feet underwater, buried under sediment? Impossible to find without knowing exactly where they were. We would never know they existed. We would build our timeline of human development around the inland cultures who built from stone, who happened to survive in locations we can excavate. And we would be wrong about the whole story. Not because we are bad at archaeology, but because the evidence is simply gone. This is what the search for Atlantis really confronts us with. Not whether one specific island sank, but the reality that entire chapters of human history could be lost, that the ocean has taken more than we can imagine, that the silence beneath the waves might hold answers we will never hear. I think about this when I watch waves crash on a beach. Each wave erases the sand, reshapes the shore, moves sediment grain by grain. Over millennia, waves move mountains, and we are left standing on edges, looking out at water. Maybe Atlantis is every civilization that thought it would last forever. We are doing it right now. Building cities on coastlines that are already flooding. Storing our knowledge in formats that will be unreadable in 50 years. Creating dependencies so complex that if a few key systems fail, everything collapses. And like every civilization before us, we think we are different. Miami Beach is spending billions of dollars raising streets and installing pumps to deal with sea level rise. The water comes up through the storm drains now, not during hurricanes, during normal high tides. The Atlantic Ocean is reclaiming land that humans claimed from marshland a century ago. Engineers are buying time, maybe a few decades, but everyone knows the ocean will win eventually. Venice has spent €6 billion on the Mose project, a system of movable barriers designed to protect the city from flooding. It works, mostly, when the barriers are raised, but the barriers cannot stay up permanently. Venice still floods. The city is still sinking. And sometime in the next century, the barriers will not be enough anymore. Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia, is sinking so fast that the government is planning to move the entire capital to a different island. The city of 10 million people is subsiding up to 10 inches per year in some areas due to groundwater extraction and the weight of construction. The Java Sea is rising. In 30 years, much of northern Jakarta will be underwater. This is not speculation. This is not climate catastrophe fear-mongering. This is documented reality happening right now. And these are just the cities we are trying to save. Hundreds of coastal communities around the world are already being abandoned. Island nations are watching their territory disappear beneath rising tides. In 200 years, when archaeologists study our era, they will find drowned cities. Miami, Venice, Jakarta, Bangkok, Alexandria, New Orleans. They will excavate homes where families lived, streets where children played, buildings where people worked, and they will wonder why we built so close to water when we knew it was rising. They will wonder why we thought we were exempt from what has happened to every coastal civilization in history. But here is what really keeps me up at night. The physical cities are not what we will lose. What we will lose is the knowledge. Your photos are stored in the cloud, which means they are on hard drives in data centers, encoded in magnetic patterns that degrade over time. The companies that maintain those servers are businesses that can fail. The file formats we use today will be obsolete in 20 years. The platforms we trust will disappear. If our civilization collapsed tomorrow, if the power grid failed and did not come back, within a generation most of our digital knowledge would be gone. Hard drives degrade without power. Solid-state drives lose data. CDs and DVDs become unreadable. And even if the physical media survived, who would have the equipment to read them? We have created the most technologically advanced civilization in human history, and we have made our knowledge more fragile than it has ever been. Paper lasts centuries. Stone lasts millennia. Digital storage lasts decades at best. The irony is profound. We know more than any previous civilization, and we have preserved it in the most impermanent format possible. I am not saying this to scare you. I am saying it because it is true, and because recognizing our own fragility might be the most important thing we learn from searching for Atlantis. Every civilization thinks it is building something eternal. The Romans built roads and aqueducts designed to last forever. Many did last, for a while, but the knowledge of how to maintain them was lost when the empire fell. The roads are still there in places, crumbling, overgrown, no longer functional. The Mayans built pyramids that have survived 1,000 years of jungle, but the knowledge of their written language was lost so completely that it took cryptographers and computers to partially decode it. We can see their monuments. We cannot fully read their words. The Egyptians built in stone specifically because they understood impermanence. They knew wood rots, papyrus crumbles, memory fades. So they carved their important knowledge into granite and limestone, and even then, we have lost most of what they knew. The Library of Alexandria burned. The papyrus scrolls decayed. The oral traditions died with the last speakers. If ancient Egypt, with its obsession with permanence and its stone architecture, could not preserve its knowledge intact, what makes us think our glass towers and silicon chips will do better? This is not about guilt. This is about humility. We are not building monuments to outlast us. We are making noise, incredible sophisticated noise, but noise that will fade quickly once we are not here to maintain it. And maybe that is okay. Maybe every generation is supposed to figure things out for themselves. Maybe knowledge is meant to be rediscovered, not just inherited. But it means that when we search for Atlantis, when we wonder what ancient civilizations knew and lost, we are also asking what we will be to future archaeologists. What will survive of us? What will they puzzle over? What will they get wrong about who we were? They will find our ruins underwater, our cities claimed by the ocean we knew was rising. They will find fragments of our technology that they cannot fully understand. They will find evidence that we knew things, sophisticated things, and they will wonder why we did not do more to preserve it. And maybe they will tell stories about us, about the civilization that connected the whole world but could not save itself, about the people who knew everything and remembered nothing. Maybe we are building our own Atlantis. Not intentionally, not dramatically, just by being human, by thinking we are permanent when we are not. Maybe the lesson is not about finding what was lost. Maybe the lesson is about recognizing what we are losing right now, while we still have time to decide what matters enough to save. I don't know if Atlantis was real. After all this, after months of research, after examining evidence and reading papers and trying to be fair to every side of the argument, I still don't know, and I think I'm okay with that. Maybe that's the most important thing this search has taught me. That not every question needs an answer. That some mysteries can remain mysterious. That the inability to solve something doesn't mean the search was worthless. We live in a world that demands certainty. Every question is supposed to have a definitive answer available within seconds. Every mystery should be solvable with enough research, enough data, enough technological sophistication. We are uncomfortable with ambiguity. But the older I get, the more I realize that certainty is overrated. That the most interesting conversations happen in the space between knowing and not knowing. That wonder lives in uncertainty. There is a difference between mystery and conspiracy. Conspiracy demands answers. It insists that someone knows the truth and is hiding it. Mystery invites exploration. It says there are things we don't understand yet, maybe things we will never understand, and that's part of being human. It makes you curious. Atlantis is a mystery, not a conspiracy. Whether Plato was describing something real or creating philosophy through fiction, whether Egyptian priests preserved genuine ancient knowledge or embellished local disasters, Whether there were sophisticated maritime civilizations before the Younger Dryas, or humans were less advanced than alternative historians claim, we may never know for certain. And that's okay, because what this search has given me, what it has given everyone who has ever wondered about Atlantis, is not an answer. It's perspective. Perspective about how much we don't know, how much has been lost, how fragile human knowledge really is, how the ocean keeps secrets, how time erases more than it preserves. Perspective about our own civilization. How we are not as permanent as we think. How we are building our own Atlantis right now with our coastal cities and our digital libraries, and our assumption that tomorrow will always look like today. Perspective about ancient people. How they were not primitive. How they understood things we had to relearn. How they looked at the same stars we look at and wondered the same questions we wonder. The hours I've spent thinking about this, reading, researching, wondering, those hours weren't wasted because I didn't find Atlantis. They were time spent in awe, time spent recognizing how small I am and how vast the mystery is, time spent feeling connected to everyone else who ever looked at the ocean and wondered what lies beneath. You don't have to solve it. You can just sit with it. You can let the questions remain questions. Maybe what Atlantis teaches us, regardless of whether it was real, is epistemic humility. The wisdom of saying, I don't know without feeling defeated. The patience to live with ambiguity. The recognition that some of the most important things in life are the things we can't prove. We can respect ancient peoples without claiming they had lost technology. We can acknowledge mysteries without inventing conspiracies. We can wonder together without demanding that everyone agree on answers. The search for Atlantis connects us. Across centuries, across cultures, across beliefs. Plato wondered about it. Egyptian priests told stories about it. Medieval sailors drew maps trying to find it. Victorian scholars wrote books about it. Modern researchers use satellites to search for it. And tonight, right now, you and I are wondering about it together. That shared curiosity, that companionship in mystery, maybe that's more valuable than any answer could be. So wherever Atlantis is, whatever truth hides beneath those waves or that sand or that time, it can wait. The mystery will still be here tomorrow. The questions will still invite exploration. But right now, you've done enough wondering for one night. You've traveled far. Through time, through theories, through the depths of human memory and the silence of the sea. You've considered catastrophes and wondered about lost civilizations. You've looked at evidence and lived with uncertainty. That's enough. You can rest now. Your bed is soft. Your breathing is easy. The world will still be mysterious in the morning, and that's exactly as it should be. Let the questions drift away like boats leaving harbour. Let the theories fade like stars at dawn. Let the ancient world keep its secrets while you keep your peace. Whatever you're searching for in your own life, whatever mysteries you carry, you don't have to solve them tonight. You can just breathe. You can just be here. You can just rest. The ocean will still be there tomorrow, keeping whatever it keeps. The satellites will still orbit, watching the Earth. The researchers will still search. The mystery will still exist. But you, right now, you deserve sleep. You deserve rest. So close your eyes if you haven't already. Let your shoulders drop. Let the weight of wondering lift. May you rest well. May the morning find you curious again. But tonight, let the search end. Let the questions quiet. Let sleep come gently. Thank you for wandering with me. Thank you for staying this long. For following this journey into the depths of mystery. Whatever Atlantis was, whatever truth it represents, it has given us this moment of shared wonder, this late-night companionship, this permission to live with questions. Sleep well. The mystery will wait. Rest now.